Darren, you've recently got a $3.6 million deal across the line. You've been doing this for some time now. You're a chartered accountant. In your experience so far, let's talk about, well, from your and in your opinion, what are the three things that sellers who sell their business quickly in the market all have in common? And what is it that you do as part of your brokerage pre-sale advice step to tick those boxes and see if there is an alignment and if there is the appropriate readiness?
Yeah, I think with this, as you mentioned, there is three core elements to this. So the first point, and as you'd expect, really, is the price. And so, what is the ideal scenario for me when working with my clients is to come to a point of what is the price going to be? Not a big range, not having them thinking it's going to be at the top of a range when really the expectation is probably at the bottom end of the range. So there's a mismatch between myself and the client. It really is honing in on what is the price going to be. And then also having a discussion with the client probably around what's the floor, what's the absolute minimum that they believe is fair in terms of the business. And then from that point, we work to achieve a much higher number. I'd say that's number one.
What happens if you don't do that with the client before you take the business to market?
Well, I think with that, if there's either a broad range or no kind of agreed price, there's never a point where I could have certainty with a particular buyer that if they can achieve what my client is looking for, there's going to be a successful outcome. It's like a moving target. Depending on how things maybe are moving, the client potentially may just want a big piece of work and now think something's changed dramatically in their business. Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. But with that, we have to have, based on a good history of the business, maintainable earnings, where it sits today, a fair market value. We have to agree that. So then we know going to market, we're both aligned. There's no discrepancy. There's no mismatch. Again, I come back to one of the pitfalls, I think, is having that range. It's between, I'll just use silly numbers, 1.5 and 1.7, let's say, where the seller's hopefully thinking, wait, will I hit 1.8? Will it touch 2 million? And is the valuation looking at the other side going, if we can stretch it to 1.1, suddenly we've now got a massive gap between what's been set as probably an expectation and the underlying reality. So I think it's best to avoid that at all costs and have pretty much to the dollar amount, this is the price. This is where we're going.
Yeah, agreed. What would be number two for you?
So I think if we've gone from, okay, we know what the price is, then I think it is, what are we selling in terms of the business? And what I mean by that is, are we selling the shares of the business, or is this fundamentally an asset sale of that business? And as you rightly know too, Dan, that there's two different contracts to this, the two very different outcomes from probably tax perspectives as well. And this is not something we can leave to the point of where we're at due diligence. What are we going to do now? Everything has to be prepped and agreed before that, so that everything can be prepared depending on which path we're taking, because they are very different. So that also has to be agreed upfront before we go to market.
I think on that point as well, the businesses that sit on the market for a long time have really only talked about price. They haven't even talked about how they're going to sell it.
Well, yes, and I think if that part's agreed, literally one of those two paths, selling the shares, selling the assets, what's this going to be? And then I think we come to the third point, which is then, what are the transaction terms of the sale? Because that, again, can be very different depending on a number of different factors in different businesses, industries, etc. Whether the vendor wants to make a quick exit, whether they're prepared to have a longer transition period. And again, that can influence the price. Because again, it drives more trust and more certainty, certainly around where we can build in the appropriate transition period. So there's continuity in the business, clients are embedded with the new owners under new management, however that looks. So therefore that the value of the business is upheld and maintained. And therefore, going on from that, typically now we see whether it's a deferred consideration or potentially some form of earn-out. Again, that protects kind of both sides with that. It's in both interests to make it the most successful outcome. And so again, I think it's really key to know what that looks like. Not absolutely, because each buyer will probably have a different set of requirements that they're looking for attached to their value and price for the business. So we can work with that. But if we've got a broad framework of what that looks like and what's acceptable within that, then I think those three elements, having that, the price, the what, and then the kind of how is it all going to be managed and transitioned.
Well, but that's right, because the how really affects the price. The how is the context of the price as well. And I mean, you've just had a deal where the earnout period achieved $1 million higher than the contract price.
Yes.
And, you know, sellers that are out there, like, you know, that roughly 60 to 70% of business sales in the US are seller financed, like a huge amount of them. It's like 10% maybe in Australia. And what seller finance does, or what offering terms with your price does, it actually increases the value because it de-risks the perception of the business for the buyer. These are conversations that I don't think enough sellers have thought through before they're offering the business for sale, and you know, are actually overly concerned about transaction terms when really they shouldn't be. They can create significantly better outcomes.
I was just going to add, Dan, I think there's almost a mindset shift there that's probably going to come in, that where before I think there's probably been a lack of trust in that sort of sense in the new operators, and can the existing owner feel that the new operator can do as good a job or even take it to new heights with new motivation, new energy, new impetus, maybe bringing different skills in. So I think that's why it's probably quite key again to ensure where possible we get the best match in terms of the buyer going forward for that particular business. Because then
it's really hard to manufacture trust between a buyer and a seller who've met for, you know, a month or two. Actually, the only way to do that is through prompt communication. In some ways, in some aspects, it's actually not even the nature of the communication. It's about prompt communication. Like, really, prompt communication is the one thing that genuinely develops trust quickly.
Yeah.
In the absence of two parties, you know, not knowing each other for longer than a few weeks or maybe a month, maybe 2 months tops, then they're searching for ways to be able to trust each other. They both want to be able to trust each other. And the one thing that immediately dismantles trust is poor or lack of communication in a reasonable fast time frame. If a buyer is prompt, and if a buyer wants earn-out periods, or if they want, you know, seller finance, or if they want to be able to demonstrate themselves as being credible, they've got to be fast. They've got to be fast to respond to everything, and they will get most of what they want.
I'd agree with you, Dan, and I think there's maybe another part to it as well. So in terms of having the business ready for sale and how we can advise our clients is having all of the documentation, the financial statements, the information on the business ready to go and kept up to date potentially as time progresses, but having that ready to give to buyers. So there's speed of communication on both sides, lots of transparency. Here's where we are. And I say transparency in the context of what can be commercially shared that's not sensitive and doesn't cause any risk. But in terms of the pure understanding of the business, the numbers, the structure, what's there, how it's made up, here it all is, right, brilliant, this is what I'm looking for. And I think that will help them come together then. You're absolutely right. And I think that's where our role really is really quite strategically important for them in that piece, to ensure that speed and momentum is there on both sides.
You're really touching on the buyer journey experience there. And, you know, it's something we're going to start doing, and I'm actually working on this with a client at the moment, is very clearly the buyer journey and the set of disclosures. And actually having, you know, because generally what happens at the moment across, you know, most brokerage firms, number one is the information deck gets sent out to the buyer. Buyer then puts together a list of questions or shows that they have a secondary interest. And then everything after that point becomes tailored to the buyer's questions. Actually, I think what we're going to really start testing out is actually having then level 2 and level 3. And just thinking about level 2 for a moment as an example. So, okay, here are the skeletons in the closet. They're probably not going to be in the first information deck, but they certainly will be a set of questions that any prudent buyer will want to know. And it'll be time to then release them in phase 2. And simply just having a click, here is phase 2, is all the questions we anticipate you've asked from the IM. Here are all your responses. Ready to go. Buyer says, I've got some more questions. Great, no problem. Here's more information for you. And I think like that's the sort of the buyer journey that we've been speaking about over the last couple of weeks that we sort of do inherently, but I think we can bring a little bit more structure to that and just really create that confidence early on with the buyer. So let's get cracking on that and really just refine that process to make it literally one click. Buyer says they're interested. Boom. Here's your next set of information.
Yeah. Almost answer the questions before they've asked them.
100%. I mean, we already have in our minds, right? We already know roughly what they're going to be asking. We generally have already, we already have the information there ready to go. But it's just about removing that tailoring aspect as well and saying, okay, these are all the standardized questions that a prudent buyer would have. Here are all the answers. So yeah, mate, let's get cracking on that as a bit of a test run, and we'll see how that lands on the buy side.
Look forward to it.
Good stuff.
Cheers, Dan.
See you, mate.